On the surface, my life seemed perfectly organized. Peter and I lived in a cozy house in the suburbs of New York, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, and we seemed to have everything we needed for happiness. But often behind the facade of calm lies something more. And for us, our marriage was stable but had long lost the spark that once bound us together. When Peter suggested inviting his nephew Damien to stay with us while he interned at a major company, I didn't object. It even seemed like it would bring some variety into our lives. Damien arrived a week later. From the very first moment he stepped through our door, I felt something unusual about him. Tall, lean, with a confident stride and a charming smile, he seemed to light up everything around him. His energy, youth, and optimism immediately caught my attention. I found myself watching him longer than one normally watches people. Peter was delighted by his arrival, and they talked a lot about his plans and work. I, on the other hand, tried not to give much thought to my inner feelings. He was just my husband's nephew, I kept reminding myself. Yet, with each passing moment, I felt an increasing attraction. It was subconscious, but so strong that I desperately tried to suppress it. With Damien's arrival, our usual routine began to change. He brought with him a breath of fresh air, a new life. Dinner conversations became livelier, and the house filled with a lightness that had long faded from our everyday lives. But at the same time, I sensed something else. Something that stirred my emotions and made me wonder how much our lives would change with his presence. With each passing day, I noticed more and more how Damien paid me extra attention. It wasn't overt, just subtle hints that flickered in our everyday conversations. Glances that lingered on me a little longer than they should. Questions that touched not just on my hobbies or work, but on more personal matters. In these small details, there was a certain tension, which I diligently ignored, even though I felt it growing stronger. In Peter's presence, everything seemed innocent, but when Damien and I were alone, the atmosphere shifted. I caught myself sometimes even looking forward to those moments, brief but filled with unspoken desire. At first, it was almost unnoticeable. I attributed my feelings to simple curiosity or to the fact that I enjoyed interacting with a young, energetic man. But over time, I began to sense how Damien increasingly tried to get closer, even in the most subtle gestures. He would sit closer to my chair at breakfast, offer to accompany me if I had to go out, and his gaze seemed to search for something in my face that I couldn't quite understand. One day, after returning home from work, I decided to take a shower. The water flowed over my body, washing away the tension of the day, and I allowed myself to relax. But suddenly, I was overwhelmed by a strange feeling, the sudden sensation that someone was watching me. I slowly turned my head, and through the opaque shower curtain, I saw a faint silhouette. The figure stood still, and I felt my pulse quicken. I was sure I had closed the bathroom door. I slowly pulled back the curtain. There was no one there, just the open door, which I was certain I had left shut. My mind immediately spiraled into a chaos of guesses and doubts. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light. Or maybe I had gotten so lost in my thoughts that I was seeing things that weren't really there. But my intuition wouldn't let me rest. I couldn't say for certain who it was, but a vague sense of unease began to take root inside me, as if something had crossed a boundary. That same evening, after I had taken a shower, Peter, Damien, and I were invited to a corporate party organized by his company. I still felt a lingering unease after the strange incident in the bathroom, but I decided to distract myself and focus on the evening ahead. The three of us headed to the event where Peter's colleagues had gathered. The night unfolded as usual: conversations, laughter, and plenty of wine. Peter, as always, preferred not to stay too long at these events and soon approached me, saying he was leaving early. He offered for me to leave with him, but I declined, deciding to stay with Damien. It seemed harmless, just extending the evening, enjoying the company. After Peter left, the atmosphere between Damien and me shifted. We continued talking, laughing, but every touch, every glance between us heightened the tension inside me. The alcohol added to my boldness, and soon our words carried a different undertone. I noticed how his gaze lingered longer on my face, how intently he listened to every word I said. As most of the guests began to leave and we were almost alone, helping to clear away the glasses, I felt the moment was inevitable. Damien stepped closer, his hand lightly brushing against mine. That brief gesture was charged with so much tension that I shivered as if struck by a spark. My breathing grew shallow and my heart raced. His eyes were filled with desire, and that pushed me towards something I hadn't even dared think about before. Slowly, almost hesitantly, I stepped toward him. It was like a magnet. I couldn't stop, couldn't turn away. Our faces were so close now, and I could feel his breath on my skin. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about Peter or about how wrong this was. All I could feel was the overwhelming pull toward him. Our lips met. The first kiss was light, almost weightless, but it was enough to ignite a fire in my chest. I felt Damien responding to my impulse, his hands gently wrapping around my shoulders, and the kiss deepened. It was slow but filled with passion, each touch revealing the long-held tension we had both been suppressing. His lips were warm and confident, and my hands, almost involuntarily, found their way around his neck. With each passing second, I sank deeper into the moment, forgetting everything around us. This moment was just for the two of us, and nothing could shatter the illusion. Time seemed to stop. It felt like we were the only ones in the world, that this was right, despite the inner awareness of how forbidden it was. When we finally pulled away, I couldn't believe what had just happened. My heart raced as if it would burst from my chest, and my mind was in chaos. That moment had changed everything, and I knew there was no turning back. After that first kiss, I returned home, trying to convince myself that I could still fix everything. It was a mistake, an infatuation I shouldn't allow myself to be drawn into. But reality proved far more complicated. Every morning I woke up thinking about Damien, and every glance he threw my way reignited the fire inside me. I tried to go back to my normal life with Peter, attempted to be the caring wife, but increasingly felt like I was playing a role in a play I could no longer control. Damien was always there. Every interaction between us grew more tense, even the briefest touches or glances. I found myself coming up with excuses just to be alone with him. At first, it was short encounters in the kitchen, moments when Peter wasn't home, but soon it grew into something more. We began secretly meeting, in hidden corners of the city, in hotels, far from prying eyes. With each new meeting, our attraction grew stronger. Every kiss was filled with a passion I could no longer control. We spent hours in each other's arms, forgetting everything else around us. In those moments, I didn't think about Peter or the fact that this affair was tearing apart everything that had been built over the years. I was completely consumed by my feelings for Damien, regardless of the consequences. But with each return home, it became harder and harder. I began to feel torn between my duty to my husband and the passion that had taken hold of me. Every time Peter hugged me or talked about his future plans, a wave of guilt surged inside me. But the moment I saw Damien again, all that guilt melted away, replaced by an overwhelming desire I could no longer stop. The news of Peter's illness came suddenly. It all started with a routine doctor's visit that ended with alarming test results. He was diagnosed with a condition that required immediate treatment, and soon he was hospitalized for further evaluation and therapy. It was frightening and painful, but as I would soon realize, not just for him. I was supposed to be by his side, supporting him during these difficult days. I knew that, but the reality was far more complicated. The situation with Peter only deepened my bond with Damien. Every time I returned home from visiting Peter in the hospital, I felt drained. But Damien was always there, ready to comfort me with his attention and warmth. We started spending more and more time together. While Peter lay in the hospital, I sank further into this forbidden affair. Instead of being by my husband's side, I found solace and passion in Damien's arms. Our encounters became even more frequent, and each time I felt myself losing more control. In the walls of our home, which should have been a place of peace, something was happening that was tearing me apart inside. My guilt grew, but it wasn't strong enough to stop me. My desire for Damien outweighed everything: my moral principles, my obligations to my husband, even my own emotions. I knew I was betraying Peter at the most difficult time in his life, but I couldn't stop the fire burning inside me. Each evening, when I returned home from the hospital, I didn't feel relief, only guilt gnawing at me. But as soon as I was with Damien, all doubts disappeared, and I surrendered fully to these feelings. The deeper our affair went, the harder it became to return to reality. Our meetings with Damien became bolder. We were no longer content with hidden corners of the house or empty parking lots. Each time we grew more daring, meeting in places where we could be seen. It fueled the passion, but it also heightened the sense of danger. Once we met in a cafe downtown where we risked running into someone Peter knew. We tried to be cautious, avoiding attention, but the tension in the air was palpable. It felt as if we were being watched. Not physically, but as if the very air around us was aware. I increasingly found myself thinking that we might be discovered. Each time Damien touched my hand or shoulder, I would tense up, expecting someone to walk in or suddenly appear at the door. In those moments, I noticed that my nerves were stretched thin. Once, while we were in a car in a remote part of town, I suddenly felt my heart skip a beat. Glancing over my shoulder, I thought I saw someone watching from a distance. But in the darkness, there was nothing. During moments of passion, when we were so close that I could feel his breath on my skin, I would lose my grip on reality. But then reality would crash back in. Once, when we were at my house, I heard the front door click open. Instant terror seized me. I thought Peter had returned unexpectedly. We both froze. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. But it was just the wind causing the door to react. Still, that moment was a reminder. Everything could end at any second. The fear of being caught grew stronger every day, but so did our connection. The more I feared the consequences, the more intense our passion became. Paradoxically, the sense of danger made everything even more desirable. I was living on the edge, balancing between fear and desire, and that line was becoming thinner. I could no longer ignore the reality. My life was on the brink of disaster. But every time Damien touched me, I forgot everything. The feeling that we could be caught at any moment only heightened the intensity of our encounters. Felt it more and more. The need to end it. My encounters with Damien were becoming increasingly dangerous, and each one deepened my internal conflict. I knew I couldn't keep betraying Peter, especially not during such a difficult time for him. It was hard with Damien, but I decided that we had to part ways. However, soon after, I received news that turned my plans upside down. Peter told me that Damien wasn't returning to Los Angeles. He had found a job with one of the companies Peter's firm worked with, and now he was staying in the city. This news sent a shockwave through me. I had hoped that our affair would end naturally when he left. But now, Damien was a permanent fixture in our lives. The next day, I went to the hospital to visit Peter. He looked tired, but there was a slight smile on his face. We sat in the room, and I tried to suppress the guilt that had been haunting me. I thought about how I could break things off with Damien, but each attempt felt futile. Peter looked at me and sighed. "Lena, I know we've grown apart lately." His words cut through me. I lowered my gaze, unable to meet his eyes. He continued, "You've always been there for me, and I'm so grateful for that. I don't know how I would have managed without you." My heart clenched with guilt. I couldn't believe he was thanking me for my support when I had been with Damien. I tried to hide my turmoil, responding, "It's my duty, Peter. You're my husband." He nodded and added, "But we both know something's changed. I want things to go back to the way they were. We can fix this together, right?" His words were like daggers. He wanted to restore our relationship while I had already gone too far. I knew continuing my affair with Damien would destroy everything Peter and I had built over the years. But something inside me couldn't let go of Damien, even after I realized that our relationship was threatening everything. I nodded, unable to say anything more. But deep down, I knew the trap I had fallen into was tightening. Staying with Damien meant losing Peter. Leaving Damien seemed impossible. But I had no choice. I couldn't keep tearing apart my life and the lives of those I cared about. We met that evening as usual, but something about Damien felt off. He seemed tense, and when he finally spoke, I knew the news would be unexpected. "Lena, I need to tell you something. My girlfriend in Los Angeles, she's pregnant." The words hit me, but not as hard as I thought they would. I was more surprised than hurt. But what really shook me was the fact that he had hidden the existence of a girlfriend all this time, let alone the fact that she was pregnant. "You kept this from me all along?" I asked, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I didn't know how to tell you," Damien said, looking uncomfortable, and then he added, "I've decided to go back to her in a month." I froze. He was planning to continue our affair for a little longer, knowing it would soon end. It was unbearable to realize that I had been nothing more than a temporary fling, that all my feelings and emotions meant little to him. He had already made his decision, but for now, he still preferred to be with me. "A month?" I repeated quietly, struggling to believe what I was hearing. He nodded, avoiding eye contact. This news became another heavy burden I would have to carry. The day after my conversation with Damien, I went to the hospital to visit Peter. He looked slightly better, but his eyes were full of questions. I sat next to him, feeling the weight of guilt growing inside me. He looked at me intently, his voice calm but filled with concern. "Lena, you've been visiting less often. I'm worried about you," he said. "Work," I replied quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. "The workload has increased and I'm trying to keep up." He gave me a skeptical look but didn't press further. I avoided making eye contact, knowing that he sensed something was off. My heart raced. How could I explain that my free time had been spent with Damien, not at work? Peter wasn't a fool. He began noticing that I was acting strangely. My visits grew shorter, our conversations more strained. I withdrew more and more, avoiding his questions and distancing myself. Sometimes I could feel his gaze on me as he sat in silence, as if trying to read what was going on in my head. "Lena, is everything okay? You seem distant," he asked one day as I hurriedly said goodbye. "Everything's fine, really. It's just a lot of stress at work and with your treatment." I smiled, trying to hide my growing anxiety. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. There was worry in his eyes. He began asking questions about how I spent my time, who was with me, but each time I found a way to steer the conversation in a different direction, reassuring him that everything was under control. I continued hiding my relationship with Damien, not realizing that the truth might be closer to coming out than I thought. Peter, although he didn't show it, had already begun piecing things together. Peter had been feeling better in recent days. He spoke with the doctors, persuading them to discharge him early, and finally they agreed. Excited about returning home, he decided to surprise Lena with a romantic evening. He bought her favorite flowers and prepared to make the evening special, heading home without telling her he was coming. When he arrived, everything seemed normal. However, as he entered the house, an unusual silence greeted him. He thought perhaps Lena was busy and paid no attention to it. Quietly, Peter climbed the stairs, ready to surprise her in the bedroom with flowers and affection, but what awaited him behind the door was devastating. Opening the door to their bedroom, Peter froze. On the bed, Lena and Damien were consumed by each other, so engrossed that they didn't even notice him standing there. He stood in the doorway, unable to believe what he was seeing. The world he had built was crumbling before his eyes. Everything he thought was solid and secure was destroyed in an instant. Peter stood in shock, the bouquet slipping from his hands onto the floor. Words stuck in his throat, and he couldn't move. Lena and Damien finally noticed him, but it was too late. Their betrayal was laid bare, and no excuse could bring back what Peter had lost in that moment. Trust, his family, and the wife he had loved so deeply. The shock that gripped Peter quickly turned into rage. Lena and Damien finally realized they had been caught. Lena jumped up from the bed, trying to find words, but Peter didn't give her a chance. "How could you?" His voice trembled with anger. "You and my nephew? I never expected this betrayal." His shout filled the room, and Lena, in confusion, couldn't find the words. Peter was furious. He screamed at her, at Damien, demanding answers, but there were none. Just silence mixed with his cries. "I gave you everything," he continued, "and you betrayed me when I was at my most vulnerable." Lena stood before him, searching for words, but she knew there was no justification. Suddenly, Peter clutched his chest, his face turning pale, and he collapsed to the floor. The pain was unbearable. "Peter!" Lena screamed, rushing to him. "Please hold on, I'll call an ambulance." In panic, she dialed emergency services, explaining the situation to the operator. As she spoke on the phone, Peter, despite the pain, pulled out his own phone and called his boss. "Fire Damien immediately," he said, struggling to contain the pain. "I don't want to see him in my company or my life ever again." The ambulance arrived within minutes and rushed Peter to the hospital. But even on the way, he didn't stop. Over the phone, he connected with his lawyer, giving instructions to prepare all the necessary documents. Peter had made his decision. Lena wouldn't get a penny. He ordered her stripped of all rights to the property, including their home. When Lena returned home after visiting the hospital, she was greeted with a notice from Peter's lawyer. She had to leave the house. She had lost everything: financial support, her home, and Peter, who had once been her rock. In desperation and without any means of support, Lena was forced to move back in with her parents in the countryside. She left behind the city life she had once cherished, now sitting by the window of her parents' old house. Lena reflected on how one mistake had destroyed everything of value in her life. The passion that consumed her had cost her everything: her husband, her home, and the future she thought was secure.